I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest I'm very happy to be speaking with. He's a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago and the author of a new book that we're going to be talking about today entitled Land Power. Who has it, who doesn't, and how that determines the fate of societies. Welcome to Parallax Views, Michael Albertus.
Thanks for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Michael, the first question I wanted to ask you off the bat has to do with your previous books. I'm now familiarizing myself with those books. So you had a previous book, Property Without Rights. I'm looking over my list here. Give me 1 second. Authoritarianism and the Elite Origins of Democracy, Coercive Distribution, and Autocracy and Redistribution. Is there any connection between these previous books and the book Land is Power?
Yeah, so I study how countries allocate opportunity and well-being among their citizens and the consequences this has for society. And that involves understanding things like how government works across both democracy and dictatorship, the interplay between inequality and redistribution in different societies, and what supports long-run economic and political development. And I explore those themes in those prior books, and they all came to inform Land Power. But this new book has a broader and a more long-term view of the role of land in human societies, including how land came to be power, how it shapes power, and how that determines the fate of societies. So there's a crucial element, given the fact that I'm a political science professor, there's sort of a political through line to a lot of these. In these earlier books, I'm exploring why it is that some governments are reallocating land and others aren't, and the problems that they have and the distortions that they create, within the political system and to the economy and society. And so some of those things do feature in this new book as well. But this new book, again, has a broader, more long-term view. It looks at a much wider range of societies and different social problems. And there's also a forward-looking element to this new book that is not there so much in the previous books, in the sense that while I document different problems that can arise from the misuse of land power or the ways in which it's used and the distortions that it creates, there are also opportunities today to address those problems in societies, and this book sets out examples of how that's being done and where we can go from here.
You want to talk a little bit about the title, Land Power. That's a title that just stands out to me. It's a very simple title, but I think people may wonder, well, what does that mean? What does land power, what does he mean by that?
Right. And land power is so what I think of when I think of land power, I think of the power that the ownership of land per se confers to those who hold it. And there are economic and social and political dimensions to that power that derives from land ownership. And because land is power, those who own it come to dominate those forms of power, and those who don't come to be dominated. And we can think about those different aspects of or those different manifestations of power. Land is a valuable asset for building intergenerational wealth. The returns to land ownership are often higher over the course of time than things like income. So there's an economic advantage to land holding. There's a social advantage to land holding. Landowners have often historically received deference within communities. They're listened to a greater degree at town hall meetings. Um, and and there's a political dimension as well that goes along with that social one, which is that land ownership has historically been a marker of citizenship and conferred things as significant as the right to vote or not, right? But also today, land ownership is associated with higher rates of turnout to vote in local elections, greater engagement in the political system, and that confers a degree of political influence.
I wanted to talk about the origins of land power in the US, but maybe before we do that, how do you explain the origins of it more broadly? Um, I know that I don't know if that question is above your pay grade, because
Mhm.
it's a pretty broad question, right? Like, well, why did land become power? But I assume some listeners would want to know, like, why has land become power, and when did that start in our history as well, just human history, not just the United States, but more
Right.
broadly.
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I think it's a critical one to understanding our present. So, land did not, as far as we know, become so tightly linked with power prior to the rise of sedentary communities and the rise, more specifically, of agriculture, I think was even a
So
more
it's a
important
result of
factor.
the agrarian sort of
Yeah, not
revolution.
strictly. It's a result of of living in a specific place. Because when humans were transiting on the land in a nomadic fashion, they had a territoriality, so to speak, but they didn't necessarily have ownership over specific plots of land. But when communities became sedentary on the land year round, then it became very important as to who owns what tract of land. And when communities are sedentary, that means that they can live off of a specific area or plot of land all year round, and that requires a degree of surplus. That surplus advanced through the rise of settled agriculture at 5000 BC. And so then we really see the takeoff in the connection between land and power, such that we see in 3000 BC, there's archaeological evidence of conflict over land between different city states in Mesopotamia and different communities. And by the time of the Roman Empire, there are things like property registries where individuals are registering their property, and sometimes disputing it and the like. And so that surplus was really the generation of surplus and sedentary societies was really key, because that surplus could be used and translated from agriculture into other things, the ability to project power into other domains, right? So some people could all of a sudden specialize and divorce themselves from farming or hunting and gathering completely and become knights or kings or warriors or what have you, right? And those people tended to aggregate power. And then they projected that power over space into other societies in order to acquire more of it. And so, really, that's the time within human history where we start to see land becoming power. But of course, even by the year zero, the human population is just a couple hundred million. And so, the globe is relatively sparsely populated. But as we get closer to the present, the certainly by 1800, when we surpass a billion people, all of a sudden land is starting to become scarce in new ways, and that supercharges this relationship between land and power.
Can you explain how that supercharging happens?
Right. So, around the time of around 1800, the global population really starts to take off, even to a greater degree than it had previously. And so we move from 1 billion in 1800 to 8 billion today, which is really um, quite a significant amount of growth. And so there's population growth that's making land relatively more scarce. There's the growth and consolidation of states and the state making process. And then there's social conflict over land because of its scarcity and because of the fact that around 1800 and in a couple centuries prior, land ownership within many societies around the earth had become very unequal. So there was more social conflict over the land as well. And all of that together combined into a lot of pressure for reshuffling and reallocating land.
I also wanted to ask you, why do you think we don't think of I'm not sure people always think of land in terms of the power it confers or how ownership confers that power. What do you think that reveals to us when we start thinking in those terms? Because I think once you start thinking about land power, you can think about a number of connected issues in ways that you may not have considered before. So, for instance, I think when talking about something like slavery, it's definitely connected to land power. And sometimes I think we miss that if we don't think about the land power aspect.
Definitely. The control over land in many cases and in many societies also meant the control over people who were working that land. So, where land holding was unequal, it meant that a very small number of people controlled the vast majority of land and that other people worked that land for them and at their pleasure. And, to the most taken to its extreme, we get systems like the plantation system, slavery in the US South or the Caribbean or northeastern Brazil or the like. But it also is not so different in certain ways from feudalism, classic forms of feudalism within Europe, in which labor was unfree, and more for all intents and purposes uncompensated. And so, people were oftentimes born into feudal systems, toiled their entire lives under those feudal systems, sometimes gathering debt along the way to a landowner and died, and then passed that debt right along to the next generation, and people were bought and sold with the land. And so yes, understanding that aspect of land ownership and land power, I think, is a very valuable way of looking at labor relations as well when we think about this sort of thing historically.
Can you elaborate on that more?
Sure. So again, whether someone is free or unfree, historically has very, very closely been tied to whether or not individuals were able to own their own land. So let me paint you a picture of how this looked within the United States, right? Within the eastern seaboard of the United States. So we had, for example, in the north, we had settlers coming and in many cases receiving, modest plots of land, and land access in New England was fairly broad amongst men, and there was a relatively equal holding of land. And as a result, there was a relatively equal distribution of power. The way in which power operated was basically through town hall meetings in which property owners got together and made decisions about how they wanted to allocate taxes, how they wanted to think about education and access to health services and very basic things. But there was a significant degree of egalitarianism within those New England towns. But if you contrast that with what was occurring in the plantation South, it was a totally different picture. There, land or power, its economic and social power, was rooted in the land, and that conferred the ability of people to, not only extract from that land, but extract from people on that land and import people and use, enslave people in order to produce products that landowners themselves would benefit from. So all that had to do with the ownership of the underlying soil.
I was going to say too, it even goes into the history of voting rights in the U.S. 'Cause, I mean, uh, it used to be only white males could vote, but it also the other part of that was it was based on your property ownership. You had to be owning property, owning land.
Exactly right. Yeah, exactly right. You had to be a property owner in order to be able to vote, right? And that was something that was very crucial from the very American founding. It was built in to our into our political system. And a lot of the founding fathers had a strong belief in the notion that property ownership should confer the ability to participate in politics. That was really crucial.
Now, one of the key aspects of your book that I wanted to get into was this concept of the Great Reshuffle, which I'll admit I was unfamiliar with it before. Could you speak to what that concept is?
So the Great Reshuffle is a term that I coined through the book. It's what I call the period of upheaval in land ownership over the course of the last 2 centuries. As I mentioned before, land ownership in many parts of the world several hundred years ago was extremely unequal, and it's hard to overstate how concentrated land ownership really was in places like um, Latin America, in East Asia, and in most of Europe. But in the last 2 centuries, this set of processes in terms of population growth, state making, and social conflict all increased, and the demand for land accelerated along with the ability of governments to reallocate and reassign the land. And that sparked these big upheavals in who owns the land in societies across the globe. And that came to mark in fundamental ways nearly every country on earth and to set them on new trajectories. So you could take, for example, a country like Russia. So following the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the country seized private land holdings and later forged collectives from them that were used in part to support industrialization. And it's hard to conceive of the Soviet Union, the Cold War, and modern Russia without that. And I mentioned, the reshuffle happens in other ways too, like the United States. We've got the reshuffling of indigenous lands into small holding in New England, into the plantation economy in the South, and then later on, in terms of settlement in the West.
You also discuss in the book, as you go deeper into the Great Reshuffle, how it laid the groundwork for what you call the four horsemen of modern social maladies. Do you want to tell us what the four horsemen are and how land power relates to this?
Yeah, I'm thinking about how to structure this book. I was thinking about, what are some of the biggest problems that bedevil societies today that feel like they're endemic, like we've been struggling with them for generations. And I thought of, four in particular that are really that have a lot of power over the ways in which people live and die within societies and the ways in which societies operate. So I'm thinking about development, how developed an economy is, including things like how wealthy it is, how poor it is, and the distribution of wealth within a society. I'm thinking about racial hierarchy and racism and racial disparities across different populations. Some societies have far deeper racial hierarchies than others. Gender inequality. Some societies are marked by very significant disparities between men and women in terms of the opportunities that they have in life, the choices that they're faced with, the sorts of circumstances that they find themselves in within the household, et cetera, and also treatment of the environment, whether an environment is relatively preserved, ecosystems are preserved, or whether they're significantly degraded. And what I do in the book is I trace the reshuffling of land through the Great Reshuffle to different outcomes when it comes to these major social problems.
Well, so let's dive into one of those. When it comes to environmental degradation, can you give some examples?
Sure thing. So, two examples that I talk about in the book are Brazil's treatment of the Amazon and China's treatment of its forests. So in Brazil, what happened is that there was immense, like a lot of other countries in Latin America, Brazil was struggling with extreme landholding inequality up through, the 1960s as a legacy of colonialism in Brazil, in this case, by Portuguese colonialism. So there were a very small number of landowners that owned the vast majority of land in Brazil, and there were many people who were landless. And there was a movement to start to reallocate and reshuffle private lands into the hands of people who were landless. And there was a democratically elected leader in the early 1960s who advocated that project. He was then toppled in a military coup as large landowners came to the military and sided against the democratically elected leader, pushing back against the reallocation of their property or in the seizure of their property. And instead, the new military government came up with this idea, hey, let's open up the Amazon, let's open up the frontier where there are very few people living, and that will reduce land pressure on these large estates in more established coastal areas and agricultural areas. And so what happened is exactly that. They started colonizing the Amazon, they started developing it in different places, and and that continued over the course of decades. And now today, those initial areas of colonization and settlement in the Amazon are some of the biggest hotspots of deforestation in the Amazon and are pushing the Amazon today to the brink of collapse because of the significant amount of deforestation that has occurred in these areas. Populations have grown quite substantially. These settlements have flourished in the Amazon. People are clear cutting trees and they're putting cattle on the land and the like. And it's a huge problem for the ecosystem, but also for the broader environment and the ability of the Amazon to act as a carbon sink effectively for the planet. So that's one example. Another example, which happened in a pretty different way, was came from China, one that I talk about in the book, and this was advanced by Mao's Great Leap Forward. So in China, after World War II, the Chinese Communist Party vanquished the nationalists to Taiwan and seized central authority. And one of the first things that they did was implement the program to confiscate privately owned land and to reallocate it to peasants, oftentimes to people who were landless or had a very small amount of land. And so they did that to a large extent. And then between 1949 and 1953, and then 1955 comes around, and Mao decides to collectivize agriculture. And collectivization of agriculture was a way to squeeze surplus from the countryside in order to fuel industrialization to try and catch up with Great Britain at the time. And so one of the edicts that was handed down was to try and produce 11 million tons of steel, practically overnight. And this generated this massive devastation of forests. And it accelerated a process that began initially with collectivization. So as collectivization started, people who realized that they were going to lose access to their land and their property decided to try and strip it of whatever they could take. And that meant things like cutting down the trees and selling the timber, right? And then when it came to producing steel, people had to create these makeshift ovens to try and burn down, or to melt down everything from, silverware to basic farming implements in these backyard ovens. And these ovens were fueled by trees. So there was another massive cutting of trees across China, and it devastated China's forest ecosystems to a considerable degree. It's not the only thing, but it's one of the major factors that led to a real decline in Chinese forest cover.
I'm curious, and I hope this isn't too odd of a question, but reading through the book, I was struck by the ways in which, I think land power and things like the Great Reshuffle, it seems to have this sort of hidden hand of influence, even on the level of how we conceptualize social relations. What I mean by that is it sort of helps us to conceptualize certain divides. I think it creates these divides between settler and indigenous population, the so-called civilized versus savage in a colonial context, the Christian versus the heathen. It really does sort of shape the way we think about social relations. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, one of the things to me that is very elemental about land is that it is so tangible and concrete. And so you either have it or you don't. You either control it or you don't. And there are different ways. Of course, you can break that down a little bit more. There can be kind of layered rights over land, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit later when we talk about the future of land. But it is a very concrete thing, and because oftentimes it can be used for exclusion, for I own it and therefore you don't, and I can keep you out of it, and I can sort of ring fence it. It helps to create these stark divides, right? The haves and the have-nots, like you said, the settlers and the indigenous. They can't both, in the course of settlement, it didn't occur that to settlers that, hey, we can jointly operate on this. We can jointly use these resources together, right? We can share them. Rather, there was a divide that came, and it was a rather stark divide and a rather quickly implemented divide as well, right, of dispossession. And that is further advanced by these notions of hierarchy, racial hierarchy, religious superiority, etc. Because land is so closely linked to power, it can drive these cut these deep ruts through societies along major identity markers like race and gender, religion, etc.
You have a pretty lengthy portion of the book devoted to uh, the first century of the Great Reshuffle and what comes after, including collective reforms. What's the connection between land and collective reforms that are taken by governments?
So land is reshuffled in many different ways. So when the reshuffle came to different societies, it occurred in different ways. So I mentioned, for example, New England, right, where we had basically the dispossession of indigenous communities and the creation of smallholder farming, right? This kind of individual family farming. We saw that a similar pattern at the tip of South Africa and in much of Australia and Canada and the like, that type of reshuffling. We saw other types of reshuffling in other places of the world, though, and especially during, starting with the Bolshevik Revolution and the Soviet Union, there was and through the Cold War, there was a long period of time in which a number of countries decided to collectivize land, right? So land was seized from private landowners, and it was, either given to the nation formally, or it was handed over to collectives. But in both scenarios, you can get the formation of collectives, and in which case, regardless of who formally owns the land, effectively no individuals are owning the land in that case, right? Rather, it's collectively owned, it's farmed collectively. People are contributing their labor and they're getting some share of proceeds as well. So, that occurred in Russia, that occurred in China, and there are a number of other examples too.
Well, that was the lead into the next question. What are the lessons we can learn from collectivization and collective reforms in, say, the Soviet Union, China, even Cuba? And I mean, there's good and bad.
Of course. Well, so let's start with the obvious that they were economic disasters for the most part. They distorted work incentives to a very substantial degree, and generated or underpinned, I should say, authoritarianism, the ability of the political leaders and governments to extract from collectives what they needed to fuel national ambitions, and politicians who implemented these collective reforms found them very useful because they were able to push people around within these collectives. They were able to manage them better than a sea of individual, autonomous, self-sufficient farmers. And so they generated a lot of economic distortions and they led to economic failures, things like the Great Famine in China. There was also famines in the Soviet Union. Cuba has struggled for a long period of time, or struggled for a long period of time under the collectivization of agriculture as well. So they were an economic nightmare in the end. And both Russia and China significantly turned away from them and ultimately decollectivized agriculture. And it was only after they decollectivized agriculture that it started to flourish again. So that's definitely an important element of all this. At the same time, they have a little bit more of a mixed record when it comes to things like race and gender. After all, collectivization was meant to bring everyone into the project of production. And in many cases, that meant that women were also getting involved in production, maybe not always in equal ways as men, and certainly over time, the leadership structure of collectives tended towards the domination of men, and so started to replicate some of those gender inequalities. But certainly for a time, and rhetorically, they meant to work against some of those significant gender inequalities and actually had some salutary effects. So there was a bit of a disparate set of impacts when you think about it from an economic perspective versus if you think about it from some of the other perspectives, let's say of gender, race, or the like.
Now, collective reforms aren't the only type of reforms you talk about. Can you speak to some of the other types of reform that happen?
Sure. So I mentioned already these small holding types of reform, these settler reforms, right, in the US, Canada, and Australia. There's also a set of tiller reforms, which are, classic examples would be South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan in the wake of World War II. In all of those countries, there were a small number of landlords that held the vast majority of land, and most people worked as tenants on the land, and and paid very high rental rates to landlords. And as post-World War II governments came into place in those countries in the wake of World War II, they implemented very significant land reallocation programs that basically took almost all the land away from landlords and gave it to tenants in very small plots. And they were also granted, given subsidies and support and the like. And that within a generation helped to launch those economies to the forefront or towards the forefront of the global economy, help them to industrialize and move even into the post-industrial society as well. So those were very successful reforms. There are examples of those types of reforms done in places like West Bengal or Kerala and India as well. And many countries are engaged in those types of reforms today, in which they're reallocating or reshuffling land and they're giving land to individual owners. So South Africa, for example, is doing this not in its land restitution program, but in its land reform program, in which they're taking individual applicants they're granting land to those individual applicants to become small farmers, right? So those are tiller style reforms. And then there are cooperative forms, which are look a little bit like collective reforms, but aren't so severe and extreme in places like Peru or El Salvador, where large landowners were expropriated, and then their cooperatives were formed, and people entered into cooperatives, and then they gave some labor to the cooperative, and then maybe they allocated some of their labor elsewhere as well, and those tended to fare not quite as badly as collectives and collective farms, but not so much better either.
I also, and we'll get to the future of land, but I wanted to ask you about the role that native populations in both America, and I was really interested in talking about Canada in this regard as well, native populations from those two countries, how do they figure into the book?
So for most indigenous populations, land reshuffling meant displacement and removal from the land. And there were different combinations of forced removal and treaty making, depending on when you're talking about and which particular tribe you're talking about. But in both Canada and in the United States, there was the vast majority of native communities were forcibly removed from the land. And and in their stay came things like, reservations in the United States, the creation of, small tracts of land that were ostensibly meant to be autonomous spaces for Native Americans, but ultimately the federal government pretty heavily intervened in those areas as well in terms of both economic attempts at economic management and as well as politically. And a similar dynamic played out in Canada in terms of intervention into First Nations and the ultimately the degradation and if not destruction of many of their communities and cultural practices.
Now, in terms of the future, I think we have to look at the present right now. I was telling you before we started recording, this book seems very timely in light of what's happening with Ukraine, the occupied Palestinian territories, and even with Donald Trump supporters talking about turning Canada into the 51st state and wanting to take Greenland and make it part of the US. It seems like there's a lot of talk of land expansion by various nation states now. What do you make of this development?
It's certainly a troubling development, and I think that you know it's probably, to be in my view, it's the tip of the iceberg. I think it's the beginning of a new era of a territorial expansion, and it's not certainly the only era of territorial expansion in human history. There was sort of a hiatus in territorial expansion due to, the international system, international legal norms, and the set of alliances that prevailed in the aftermath of World War II. But that is really starting to fray. That international order is starting to fray. And as a result, we're seeing some of these consequences of a return to efforts at, grabbing territory, expanding access to territories. And that's also being so that's one part of the picture. There are other parts of the picture too, I think, that are fueling the current dynamic. Two of the other important ones would be population growth continues. We're moving from 8 billion today towards 10 billion people before the end of the century, and a changing climate. And, climate change now, we're seeing it all around us, and it's accelerating. It's expected to accelerate in the coming years. And that is changing the attractiveness of certain areas. So Greenland is a great example of this. Canada is another, in which northern shipping routes north of Canada, north of Russia, are going to open up as the sea ice continues to melt, and as northern seas are ice free for longer periods of time. So Arctic shipping is speeding up, and will continue to speed up in the coming decades, and that is going to make these northerly areas more attractive for strategic purposes. They're going to be more attractive for settlement, and it's going to be easier to access resources that have long been, buried far under ice. That's true of Greenland. That's true of parts of Canada as well.
I want to delve into that more. This idea of sort of the. It seems like we're moving into a new era where the prevailing international order is fraying, and I think you're right about that. I mean, I do think there's been occupations and annexations that have happened during this sort of international order. I think of, Western Sahara, the annexation of Western Sahara. But now it seems like these things are really accelerating. What does that mean going forward?
Yeah, I think you're right that they are accelerating. I mean, just in recent months, we've got, proposals on the table that are new and are seemingly serious and significant in ways that we haven't seen. So not only do we have, threats to take places like Gaza and the Panama Canal and Greenland or even Canada, but then that unleashes other dynamics as well. And so, amongst other countries. And I think that's a really critical component of this that has to be taken into account, which is to say that if everyone knows, or all the global powers know, that the global order is fraying and that more is going to be up for grabs, and they know that there's going to be a changing climate, which is going to make some land more attractive and habitable and strategic, and other lands are going to become less habitable, less strategic, then they all have incentives to be the first mover, right? To be the first one to try and grab the attractive areas. And so I think we see that. I think we see that also with China's expansion in the South China Sea. I think we see that with Russia's expansion into Ukraine and, threats over, Baltic states and the like. We see international agreements over, using Antarctica for scientific purposes. We see those agreements fraying as well, and efforts to jockey for advantage there. So I think that this is the beginnings of a new era of territorial competition in which that are underpinned again by the fraying of the global order and knowing that there's going to be a changing picture in the coming years, and that it's to everybody's advantage to get there first.
So I guess the question then arises of is there another way forward? Are we just headed towards the this new age of conquest where nation states are just trying to grab land uh and make it theirs essentially? Or is there another way forward?
Well, of course, there could be other ways forward. And in the past, in the post-World War II period, the United States was a principal architect of creating a different way forward, right? Of creating a global order in which it was much more difficult to grab land from other countries. And so it's possible that there could be this that the new global order could settle into some sort of balance of power between the US and China and perhaps Russia and the like, and that balance could foster some degree um, of status quo nature. In other words, of saying, hey, look, you've got your sphere of influence over there, ours is over here, and let's agree not to bicker over the things that are in between. In a cold War, similar to a Cold War dynamic between the United States and the Soviet Union, that sort of thing could elapse. But it also requires a degree of cooperation and of a certain restricted form of competition. And I think it remains to be seen whether that is the new that will be the new global order or not. I mean, of course, the United States or other actors could also push for a different type of global order, in which different rules are on the table. So I think a lot is open right now in ways that are that we haven't seen in the last, 75 or 80 years.
It's really interesting. A lot of this book is devoted to development of land and development of cultures. In fact, I was going to ask you about chapter 7. The arc of history is long, but it bends towards development. And the previous chapters before that, for people that are going to read the book, have to do with the underdevelopment playbook. So this word development is coming up a lot throughout the book. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so, related to some of my previous work and a lot of work that I've done over the course of the last 15 years, I found again and again that the governments that have the capacity to reallocate land, that have the incentives to reallocate land, are often authoritarian ones, and that they also have the desires to try and dominate society. And, that domination of society is something that generates a lot of distortions. It generates things like, collectivization of agriculture, the elimination of private property rights, the attempt to coerce people into political fealty, et cetera. And all of that is done through economic tools and through social and political tools. And it generates big problems for the economy ultimately. And so it generates underdevelopment. And we see that again and again. I mean, we see it in contemporary Venezuela. We see it in I've already mentioned Russia and China, but we see it at a massive scale in Mexico throughout the course of the 20th century. We see it in Peru, in the 1970s, and so we see it again and again. But we also see that there is a playbook for getting out of that trap, right? So many countries that have transitioned to democracy or that have undertaken oftentimes at the tip of a gun, so to speak, during economic crisis or the like, and have engaged with the World Bank or the IMF, have generated structural forms that have, forced the state, out of the business of managing all property and keeping tabs on what everybody is doing and using property rights insecurity to its advantage. And so in those cases, what we see ultimately development. And this chapter that you mentioned on development is one that I worked on in Peru. And there, what happened is that, as I mentioned, there was a military government in the 1970s. They reshuffled a lot of private landholding in Peru. They generated cooperatives. These cooperatives were ultimately underproductive on the land. People never wanted to go into cooperatives. They wanted them to break up. And so when the military government fell, the cooperatives fell. But the new government that came into power in 1980 was not a very strong government. Peru was undergoing an internal conflict, a civil war, and as a result, there was this kind of property rights, this fog of property rights and property rights insecurity. Nobody had any idea what was going on in the countryside whatsoever, and so that was also not conducive to development and growth and investment. When you have no idea whether you're going to be the owner of your property tomorrow or not, you're not going to invest much in it, right? And so that changed though starting in the 90s and the 2000s when Peru partnered with the World Bank and the like to try and implement much more significant property rights reforms. And it wasn't easy. It caused some significant short-term pain, but ultimately it shifted the country towards a stronger, more solid footing when it came to property rights. And I've talked to people who are for example, one guy who I talked to who lives in the Andean region in Cusco, and he is part of a family that inherited land from a cooperative, but there are multiple siblings, and amongst his siblings, they had no idea, when land is going to be divvied up ultimately. Should I build my house here or not? Because what if this land ultimately is given to somebody else? So I don't want to build my house here necessarily. And so there was a lot of underinvestment. And when the government came in and they started granting titles to people, all of a sudden they said, okay, now we have some degree of security over this particular area. Now I'm going to invest and I'm going to build my future here, right? And so we saw that being very helpful for for investment and then for partnering with outsiders as well. So it generated development there.
I hope this isn't too out of left field, but could you talk about how you got into contact with I believe it's called the Rewilding Chile Foundation, and the influence they had on the book, who they are, the work they do?
Yeah, sure. This is a really interesting organization. So, as I was thinking about the impacts of land reshuffling on the environment, I was thinking of ways in which reshuffling could be beneficial for, for conservation and for, preservation of the environment for the longer term. And I was trying to think through examples and the like, and I generated a number of examples, but one that really struck me was one that came out of Chile. And in Chile, in the last 10 years, the government has gone from preserving about 6% of its land and water to over 30% of its land and water. And that's really an incredible transformation. And part of that has come through efforts of private philanthropists, including some prominent American philanthropists that have bought up land on their own in Chile, and then donated that land, created arrangements with the Chilean government to preserve that land. So there was the partnership between the philanthropists and the Chilean government, but the other partnership too is with a rewilding foundation that was part of that grew in part out of the Tompkins Foundation, which was the set of philanthropists that donated this land in Chile. And the idea behind rewilding is to take lands that have been occupied and degraded in different ways by the human use, and to try and return them to their more natural state. And so, this organization in Chile now, after the creation, for example, of Patagonia National Park, where I did work, and that park went from private ownership to becoming a national park in the year 2018. This organization, Rewilding Chile, did a lot of work to get rid of the old ranching infrastructure, to help recuperate the native grasslands, to help the native species to come back to a greater degree, and that sort of thing, to effectively to turn the space back into a more wilder space. And that there are efforts like that not only in Chile but also in other parts of Latin America, even in the United States and in Europe as well.
I also wanted to ask you, since you brought up the World Bank, I had read a review in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette of your book, and the only criticism that the review had was, well, it doesn't focus on or the book isn't able to get into the ways in which the World Bank or the IMF may have caused real social or economic issues. I was wondering, and I'm not attacking the book bringing this up, I'm just wondering how would you respond to that criticism?
Yeah. That's a very real criticism. And I've written about that in some of my other work for sure. The way in which the World Bank came into many countries in the 1980s and the 1990s through the Washington Consensus was with a sledgehammer. It was this top-down, you will impose this view or this structure of property rights, this type of structural reform in your economy, this form of liberalization of the economy, an open market system and the like, and it generated enormous dislocations within it. It just fostered unemployment in the short term. It created a lot of backlash, and it really increased inequality in the short term as well. The but it's a more complicated picture than that, in the sense that while there was a lot of short-term pain, there was also some considerable long-term gain in many of these cases, and I think Peru is a good example of that. It really brought down its inflation rate. It got integrated much more into the global economy. It's now, an upper middle income country. And it's hard to imagine how that would have been done without that sort of structural reform. It also remains quite unequal, and the way it was done was very undemocratic in many ways. Those sorts of reforms, and so there's a real debate to be had, I think, over these reforms. I will say that, in many ways, I think the bank has shifted away from that approach and is a little bit of a softer approach now, and supports programs that are not strictly, let's say, the implementation of, individual alienable exclusive property rights, but rather also supports other forms of property rights, the coexistence of indigenous forms of property rights along with, Western forms of private property rights and the like. And so there is a debate to be had there. And it's a complicated picture, and it's one that's changed a bit over time.
If you have time for just a few more questions, I know we had scheduled for only an hour, but I wanted to ask you, when it comes to land relocation as a tool for, really generating economic and social prosperity into the future, uh, what's your best case argument for that? If someone is skeptical of land reallocation, what would you say to those folks? Like, how do you present your case?
Mhm. I think there are various reasons why you might want to think about the value of those kinds of programs, right? So, I did work recently in South Africa for the book, and there I think that there's a very compelling moral and ethical case for the reallocation and the reshuffling of land that is rooted in the apartheid era and the forced removal of, indigenous Black communities from their land. And that is within, the memory of these communities. It's in the relatively recent past. And the government promised, as part of the transition to democracy in 1994, that there would be the reallocation of this land back to communities. And so I think that there's a compelling moral case for that in certain circumstances. There's a compelling environmental case in others. In many cases, native indigenous communities are very good stewards of the land and kind of have that in their social and cultural DNA. And so thinking of, co-stewardship or co-management relationships like are occurring at a significant scale in Australia or Canada and a much more selective scale in the United States, there's an environmental case to be made for that as well. Um, and depending on the circumstances, there can be an economic case to be made too. If you think back again at these examples of places like South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, it's very hard to imagine how those economies would have modernized and advanced so rapidly without the land reshufflings that occurred there.
I just had two more questions. I was curious. I know this isn't necessarily talked about in the book as much, but we see a lot of today's richest men and billionaires buying up land. I know you've talked about this in a few other interviews. People ranging from Bill Gates to Jeff Bezos. What do you think this means for the future? This sort of land buying spree that's going on.
Yeah, it's really been supercharged since the pandemic, but it's been ongoing more generally since the Great Recession in the late 2000s. And yeah, there's this increasing trend in billionaires buying up land and institutional investing in land, both in urban land and things like apartments and single family homes, but also in farmland. And so to me, it's hey, we've got a free market and there's the capacity to do this. On the other hand, we want to be very careful about the future that we're creating, right? And that we're facilitating. Countries can and do make rules around ownership, right? And the extent of ownership. And we might want to think more carefully about that going forward because I think um, it would be retracing the past in ways that would be rather naive to allow a significant amount of land reconcentration and think that there won't be major social or economic problems as a result.
Last question I wanted to ask you was, and this is a bit complicated of a question, but when we talk about the social movements that are mentioned in the book, whether it's the rewilding movements or the land reparation movements, I think there's a tendency for some um, folks that are unfamiliar with these issues to think that, oh, these social movements are too uh, utopian, or they're being too ambitious, or how would this work? And I think people have the wrong idea about that. Can you speak to that? Do you agree with me? I don't think uh, a lot of these movements are. Um, I think they're grounded in reality, and I think people who think otherwise are missing the mark.
Yeah, in many cases, these movements have very concrete and specific goals that aren't, hey, let's return all of Manhattan, right? Let's repossess, New York City or LA or Miami and grant it back to its original owners or something like that. I think everyone understands that the practicalities of doing that sort of thing are very difficult. The vast majority of social movements are focused on more achievable, local, concrete goals, and that are
Would you
not
be able to
always.
give any specific examples of like the pragmatism you're speaking of?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Bear Ears National Monument would be a good example of the collection of a series of tribes that got together and said, "Hey, we're the traditional stewards of this land, and we want to be able to manage and steward this land in association with the federal government." And we're not granting this land back to these tribes necessarily, but they're given a very meaningful relationship with that land, and to the benefit, in my view, of just about everybody. To the benefit of the tribes, to the benefit of society as a whole, because they have a very long-term perspective in terms of how they think about the management of that land. And so that is a very, it's a concrete goal, it's a concrete outcome. It's something that is, I think, structured pretty well and could be replicated at a significant scale. So rarely are these social movements organized around, hey, just everything's got to be given back, right? Instead, it's usually much more circumscribed, much more concrete goals that are aligned with the interests, oftentimes of both sides of a given community.
In closing, what do you hope my listeners get out of this conversation? And of course, let my listeners know how they can get the book, Land is Power.
So I hope that they think a little bit more about the land under their feet and the ownership of it and kind
Could
of
you
where
repeat
that
that?
came from
It
and
cut
where.
out for a second.
Yep. Yeah. I hope that they get out of it, that they're provoked to think a little bit more about the land underneath their own feet and the history on that land and what's happened with that history. I hope that they might think a little bit about their own family history and on the land and how that's shaped where they are in the present. And I hope that they would start to think about some of these issues more broadly, and how to engage with them locally, because oftentimes there are very concrete ways to engage with issues of the land, whether it has to do with, supporting local farmers or thinking about the history of indigenous removal on the land where you live and how you might support those kinds of communities, or thinking about what you eat and how that's related to land use. and the like. There are many ways in which we could think about those, the importance of land and how it relates to our everyday lives. And so I think getting that conversation sparked is something that excites me, and I hope something that people will engage in.
And thank you again, Michael Albertus, for coming on Parallax Views. People can get the book, I assume, from any of their booksellers. Independent booksellers are the best, but if you have to go elsewhere, I understand. But I hope people will check out the book. Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.